Excellent. Thank you so much to our MCs. Thank you, everybody, for coming back. One never takes it for granted that the audience turns up again after the coffee break, so it's great that you're all here. I must admit, I'm feeling some mild trauma at the moment. It's been many years since I was involved in competitive debating. I think that applies to some of our speakers here as well. I used to chair something called the Debate Selection Committee at the Oxford Union, which is one of the oldest debating societies in the English-speaking world. And what was really interesting about that was our job was to pick people to represent the university. And lots of the topics of the debates that we went through were hardly ever on tech. Back then, in the dark ages of the late 1990s, we were discussing at most issues around genetically modified foods. Sometimes there'd be a debate about nuclear disarmament somewhere, but we didn't really talk a lot about tech. Today, of course, that world has changed, and technology is either part of or a standalone topic on so many interesting debates of our time. But really what we're going to be doing today is not just a debate on tech. We're also going to be debating an ancient tension, right? A discussion about whether we as humans are better able to deal with duality or singular purpose. And if you think about it, there's a lot of wisdom on both sides of this, right? We're told on the one hand, you can't eat your cake and have it, that you cannot walk and chew gum, but we're also told that you must try to kill two birds with one stone, right? And you must try and have many irons in the fire. The Japanese have this great saying, he who chases two rabbits will catch neither. But then the French have sayings that say, the person who avoir plusieurs cordes à son arc will do better than others, right? The one who has many strings in their bows will do better. So there seems to be wisdom on both sides here. And I think what we have asked our four guest speakers to do today is help us get to an understanding of these issues from their perspectives, right? From their expert perspectives and the areas that they are working on. So they will have time to both introduce arguments and rebut each other. I suspect that we'll see some accelerating competitiveness as we go along, which is great. I'm looking forward to that dynamic. But because today isn't just a competitive debate, it is partly an attempt at truth-seeking. We also want you to know where your starting beliefs are. What are your priors on this issue? And in the QR code responses that you all shared, a fairly overwhelming number of you, actually 45, have said that you don't agree with this motion. So we've got quite a number of people on your side, Maria and Thomas, already. But that means that we also have a strong amount of persuasive scope and ability for the proposition team, right? Who have 18 votes on their side, and are going to help us understand why this might be more true than we like to actually believe. So, without any further delay, let's dive straight into this motion, right? That Europe cannot be both sovereign and competitive on technology, that Europe cannot walk and chew gum or eat its cake and have it at the same time. And to introduce this motion to us, I'm going to ask Chloe Teven, the head of Digital Economics and Governance at the European Centre for Development Policy Management, to propose this motion that stands in her name. So, Chloe, please.
Thank you, Aaron. I think I'm supposed to come up here. But in any case, thank you, Aaron. Glad to be here with you today. Suppose, and it's not too difficult to do so, that tomorrow US President Donald Trump follows through on his threats to the EU digital rulebook or suspends the EU-US data privacy framework. In that situation, Europe is going to face a choice. Does it follow through in defending its sovereignty and fighting back? Or does it defend its short-term competitiveness and bow down to some of these threats? At some point, Europe is going to have to make decisions on these points. That applies to this kind of crisis situation, but it also applies as we think about the future and how we balance this question of whether Europe can be both competitive and sovereign on technology. So certainly Europe must aspire to strengthen both its sovereignty and its competitiveness, but there will be real trade-offs along the way. And unlike the Council conclusions last week, where you very much saw that our political leadership was not willing to make any concessions on either side, the EU is ultimately going to need to make decisions and make trade-offs along the way. So the EU must certainly strengthen its own industries, but it also needs to recognize that there are interdependencies and that diversification is potentially the most reasonable strategy along the way, rather than absolute sovereignty. So I'm going to touch on 3 points right now. The first is that sovereignty must not be a Europe-first approach. Secondly, that in the short term, there are certain industries across the tech stack where Europe simply cannot be either sovereign or competitive. And thirdly, in the short term, we may need to take certain hits in order to achieve long-term goals, whether that is in terms of sovereignty or competitiveness. So firstly, a Europe-first approach to sovereignty is very much one that I've seen espoused by many people in this space who don't really engage with international conversations. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about bi-European rules, about creating a European digital industrial policy, which doesn't take into account the fact that we actually need resources, skills, and markets that we can only get if we do business and if we engage with the rest of the world. At the same time, the Europe as model, which the Brussels effect kind of espoused, is really seeing a pushback now, particularly across the global majority countries. There is a sense that this approach is based on a Europeans feel they know better kind of approach to regulating the digital space, and there's a need to really stay open on this point. Secondly, on diversification, in the short run, the EU is in a very bad position when it comes to certain critical technologies. For example, on critical raw materials, we simply don't have the access or the capacity to become sovereign in this area. We will need to partner with others, and that means real industrial partnerships, as well as potentially partnering with Chinese businesses in certain cases. Nobody wants to hear that, but it's true. And thirdly, there will be a need for some short-term decisions in order to have long-term gains. So building European alternatives will require political will, resources, and ultimately standing up to other global powers at certain key moments. So I thus put it to you that Europe will need to make strategic choices between competitiveness and sovereignty on its road to a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Chloe, for that brilliant start. And that mention of China in particular is interesting, right? Our foresight team at CFG has done a study actually on drones, for example, and how much of that market is controlled by China. And it's a staggering 70% of the parts that are involved in drone manufacturing, just in Ukraine alone, that are actually controlled by China at the moment. And this is just one of the studies that we're trying to do to kind of think about where our strategic innovation capacity might actually lie. And you're right, because the term interdependence is actually such a core aspect of Europe's position today. But there's another side to all issues, and I'm going to invite Maria now to introduce the arguments for the opposition team. Maria will be very familiar to all of you as a writer on technology, policy, as well as politics. Maria, take it away, please.
Thank you very much. So, we can be both sovereign and competitive. But first of all, I'm going to say, what is competitive? What is competitiveness? It is a word that not even English native speakers can pronounce. It's got way too many T's in it. It's bloody impossible. We need to think not about competitiveness. We need to think about competition. So here's competitiveness. We're not doing that anymore. Competition. Because competitiveness is not a horse race that you can win. Competitiveness is not, there's no Champions League of competitiveness. You're not going to get like, we got number 1, you got number 2, you got number 3. Competitiveness is about democracy. You either have it or you don't. So to be competitive, do you know what we actually need? Competition. We need competition at every single level of the internet stack. From the currently the duopoly and the monopoly, 2 app stores, 2 operating systems, 1 advertising space for the world. We're tearing that up, and we're having competitiveness and competition at each level of the stack. So when AWS goes down, we don't lose all of our services and apps and Signal and everything. When CrowdStrike goes down, we don't lose airports and hospitals. Competition means resilience. Dependence means fragility. And so, yes, we are taking on the US big tech monopoly and duopoly, and as Anu Bradford put it, toxic innovation, extraction at every level of our internet stack, and we are just getting rid. We are finding our European spines, because I'll tell you, it's not a horse race, but what we do need to be doing is being Europeans in Europe with European values, European technology, and a European future. There is only one way we can do this, and that is to grow our backbone and introduce competition at every level of the stack. Sovereignty. Well, at the moment, we do not have sovereignty. So what we need all the way through the stack is legal sovereignty. So when you use Microsoft right now, the Americans can use the Cloud Act to spy on us, no matter what they say about a European AI, a European data center, a European branded SAP-run Microsoft Azure black box of technology that spies on us and is overtly aimed at subverting our democracy. We need technological and technical sovereignty. That is, we are not locked into ever-escalating cloud prices, 10% extra every year, $238 billion every year going to Microsoft, going to Amazon. That could be paying European taxes. That could be having payouts for European shareholders. That is technical sovereignty, where we do not have lock-in, and our infrastructure, our critical infrastructure that we are dependent on for everything that we do, is not dependent on one US company that could pull the plug on us anytime it likes when Uncle Donald or King Donald asks for it. And finally, economic sovereignty. So the revenues come to our taxes. The revenues pay for our public services. And so the profits go into funding innovation in this continent. And we need to grow a backbone to do it. You know, in the previous section, the speaker talked about tech as something that is done to us, and the AI is something that is done to us. We as Europeans need to be proud of who we are, because the world is watching us. People want to see us succeed. And our American brethren, this is not being anti-American, this is saying the best we can do to help our brothers and sisters, and for me, literal brothers in America, is to weaken the tech companies that are propping up Donald Trump. So, sovereignty is not a hashtag. It is an existential necessity. And so we get sovereignty by having competition, and we get competition by growing a backbone, using our European regulation, using our European procurement, and yes, buying Europe, supporting Europe, not just as something we buy, but as something we are, and as something that we want to continue to be. And we have this choice, we have this moment, we have it right now. And my colleague is going to talk to you about renewable energy and how we do that all the way through the stack and around our economies. Sovereignty is something that is not something we can sell off, but it is something we can only achieve through competition, through competitiveness, through being Europeans in Europe. That is how we win. Thank you.
Wonderful. Chloe and Maria, thank you so much for laying out those definitions and those arguments. We've clearly got the sides lined up wonderfully here, right? Can we do it all, or must we choose? And both sides are presenting quite stark choices here. I'm going to ask Robin to further the arguments now for the proposition team. Robin is the CEO and board member of the European Startup Network, as well as a founding member of EU Inc. So Robin, take us away.
Do I get up?
Please, yeah.
As you can tell, this is my very first Oxford-style debate, so roll the dice. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very hard acts to follow, very good points made. I would actually agree to some degree to what Maria just said about autonomy and resilience when it comes to critical infrastructure and systems. I think there's no debate about that. That's possible in this day and age. We have to protect our critical infrastructure and system. I think there's no debate about that. Everything else, and doing this blindly on all levels, I think would be a massive mistake. Why is that? And this is where I go a little bit more into my background as a technology journalist and researcher. I've been traveling quite a lot around the world to visit innovation ecosystem and startup ecosystems mostly in Europe, but also in the US, Vietnam, China, you name it. And what I found is that most of the people that are actually the core ingredient of this ecosystem, which is the entrepreneurs, the founders, do not really care about autonomy and sovereignty all that much. They care about building businesses. They care about taking their business as far as they possibly can, raising investment from the smartest investors that they can find, and scaling to a point that is the best of their abilities and their teams. They care about finding, attracting, and retaining talent. These are the conversations that I have with entrepreneurs. Sovereignty and autonomy, except when it comes to critical infrastructure and systems, is not on their minds. So, in Europe, what I believe to be true, and this is also very much accentuated by the reports that I'm sure all of you have read by Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta, is that competitiveness is our way out. We're running way, way behind on the US and China when it comes to technological innovation. We all know that. I hate it when people call the Draghi report a wake-up call. At this point, we should be wide awake, had breakfast, went to the gym, went to work, had lunch, and started our afternoons. There's no more wake-up calls. We should already be wide awake. So how do we avoid running even further behind? When we use words like sovereignty and autonomy, often these are actually pure protectionism and isolation in disguise, right? I would argue that Europe instead needs to look at its history, and also the history of Silicon Valley for that matter, and be open for collaboration, be open for working together with other ecosystems, and not try to isolate ourselves when we're already running so much behind. I think our entrepreneurs, our investors, our corporate innovators, our researchers, and our scientists deserve much better than that. That's all the time I will give myself.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. That's right. Robin reminded me quite a bit, actually, of another study that our governance team is doing on enforcement capacity, right? And how we need to build not just on issues like competition, but be able to collaborate from a position of strength amongst Europeans and its partners, so that we share those strengths. And enforcement capacity is actually quite a key one amongst them. Have a chat with the Gov team. Maria and Namita, I think, are around during the tea break, if you'd like, and Honor as well, if you'd like to have a chat with them about that. But, you know, as Robin has pointed out to us, some of these questions are not just about high-flown ideas, they're also about the ground realities that are faced by founders and people running actual businesses. So let's hear a bit from the perspective of someone who's on the ground dealing with the perspective of the government, right? I'll invite Thomas Auger now, who's a member of the cabinet of Executive Vice President Teresa Ribera, to share his thoughts on the work that he's doing, particularly in the field of clean tech. Thomas, please.
Thanks very much for having me here, and glad to be here in front of you today. So yeah, I think I would like to start with the main sentence, but indeed there is no, we don't need to choose absolutely between competitiveness and sovereignty, because these are two sides of the same coin. There is no need for us to trade our European values, or prosperity, or social economic model, or climate ambition in order to be competitive, because this is through there that we'll manage to get competitive. And I think there an easy example and a very simple example that could illustrate that the best is renewables. Today in Europe, the cheapest and the cleanest energy we can produce is also at the same time the one that we can grow in our home and be fully sovereign about. This is renewables. Today the cost of renewables is about 2 times cheaper than fossil fuels when we want to generate electricity. And it comes to a simple truth that Europe will not be able to be competitive on the basis of fossil fuels that it is not producing. We will always be paying a premium compared to countries like America or the Middle East that will be producing these fossil fuels when we want to buy it. So if we want to compete against them on this basis, we will just lose. And we're seeing it with gas prices, for example, where in Europe, the gas prices are basically 2 times the price that they are in the US. But on the contrary, if you take countries like Spain or Sweden that invested quite a lot already on the clean transition and on renewables, we can see there that they have already electricity prices that are more competitive than like in most parts of like the US and of China. So there is a chance for Europe to compete on energy. It's just it needs to compete on sovereign produced energy that are renewables and not on fossil fuels. Just last year, we imported about 375 billions of fossil fuels. So that's 375 billions that as Europeans were just giving away and not investing in our own model, in our own progress. You were mentioning like our model, our revenues, our investment in the society. And like this is where we basically reshift this like money we're putting away for fossil fuels to invest in our own sustainability. And we're already making progress with the IEA that was reporting that between 2021 and 2023, Europe already saved 100 billion euros just thanks to the new renewables we just installed. So we're seeing there with renewables, the answer is quite simple. The most sovereign energy we have is at the same time the most competitive. But this goes way beyond renewables and goes to many other clean technologies. Taking the example of like electric vehicle, for instance, we're already seeing today that the prices of driving EV over 100 kilometers is now cheaper for electric vehicles than for classic thermal cars. And this will be expected to like decline further in the future. So it's very important we continue like betting on this model. And this is already paying off in Europe. We are exporting annually around 80 billion of euros of clean tech technology to the rest of the world. So do we really want to abandon this model and like give away this investment to the rest of the world that is not waiting for us, that is still investing? China is going very fast in investing in like in their transition, and if we want to keep up, we have to be a bit more sovereign and keep investing in this renewable model. And the question is like, how can we as Europe design policies that will allow our companies to capture the biggest share of this clean tech market that will be around the world, to be able to like create a model of prosperity and competitiveness that is basically based on this sovereignty. And this is what like the Commission is doing with the current Clean Industrial Deal, but want to really put this focus on like how decarbonization can be in Europe a driver of competitiveness and sovereignty, basically looking at all the different aspects of our policy portfolio, going from energy to trade, to finance, to lean markets, to circularity, and to jobs. And so it's very important that as Europe, we basically focus on like how can we create markets for our clean technologies and our products produced in Europe that will allow us to bet on a really long-term competitiveness. And so there we have many assets we can build on. We can build on our single market. We can build on public procurement that could help creating this demand that we need to create new innovation and new business case in Europe for clean technologies, and that will allow our companies to grow and spread and be able to like take a real competitiveness chance on the overall global race. But for that, we also need to bet on our own companies, and we need to bet on sovereignty. So there, I would like to warn you and like be careful against the narrative that like we really need to choose and to compromise our sovereignty to achieve competitiveness, because we have clear indication that this is not the case, and even on the contrary, taking the simple example of the climate change impacts, we are in Europe warming up 2 times faster than the rest of the world. And while we paid around 800 billion euros to compensate for damage linked to like climate-related weather events, out of these 800 billions, 200 billion just occurred in the last year. So you have 800 billions of damage over the last 45 years, and out of which 25% just occurred in the last 4 years. So we're seeing this is accelerating, and there's already models saying that if we keep going on, at the end, climate change impact will cost Europe more or less 7% of its GDP. And so it's rather clear here that like we need to continue and reinforce on our model if we don't want to compromise our long-term competitiveness. And there, in difficult times, it's very important that we hold on to our ambition and our values. And it's very important as Europe, we don't give in to the fear or to the siren songs of the ones that didn't do their homework, of the companies that are realizing now they're falling behind because they didn't invest fast enough in the transition. Why we should not do that? Because most of the companies and like most of the people did their homework. They invested in the clean transition. They're already starting to see the benefits, and they're basically calling us to like keep moving forward, because they don't want to compromise this like long-term model for prosperity that we are building for ourselves, and so they want to keep carrying on. And then, as a summary, I think trading our values and sovereignty for competitiveness will be a huge mistake for Europe. Why? Because at the end of the world, there will be no competitiveness. So it's not about choosing one to the other. It's about taking both together to make sure both together remain. Because if we drop one and lose the other one, we're basically losing on both fronts. And it would be vain to think that like Europe will be able to compete with the rest of the world on a race to the bottom model where everyone needs to scrap standards, values, sovereignty, and so on. Because on these type of scenarios, the low-cost economies where there is like cheap labor costs, there is no social values, will be the one winning. It will not be Europe. And instead, it's important for Europe to build on these standards, on this sovereignty model, to create a model for itself that you will be helped to like basically generate competitiveness and innovation around the world and allow Europe to basically be prosperous on the long term. And this is basically Europe's chance to strive. So I will call again for like the importance of like both of sovereignty and competitiveness to go together, because there is not one without the other.
Lovely. So we've got a chance for some question and answer now. The QR code is up there. Some of you have already started submitting questions. That's great. Please keep them coming. I'll try and include as many as possible as we pose these to the team. What we'll do is I'll do a set of questions for both teams. They will then have 2 minutes to present their arguments in response to those questions. They will then, after having heard each other, have 1 more minute of further rebuttal if they'd like. Then if we have more time, which I very much doubt, because time is the ultimate finite resource, we can take another round of questions, but if we can't, then we'll move on to the closing arguments. So I want to start with a set of questions that have come in, first of all from Fernando Velasco, on how all our speakers agree that the Draghi report flagged as a wake-up call is already too late. But even as we debate this point, what do we need to do to act as if we are no longer in business as usual, right? Is Europe effectively changing and reacting in a way that is conscious to the world that is much more fast-paced than before? And we've got a question from Jacob here as well about the intensifying US-China tech competition and whether Europe's pursuit of tech sovereignty should be seen more as strategic autonomy or technological isolation. What I'd like to do is kind of look at both of these as, they're both questions about change, if you like, right? Are we in a position to change as fast as the world needs us to or not? So my question then for the proposition, drawing from Fernando and Velasco's question, is your arguments paint a great deal about how Europe is stuck in structural interdependencies that don't allow it to transcend this trade-off, right, between sovereignty and competitiveness. So the question to you is, why can't we change? Right? What is stopping that possibility of transformation? Why can't we evolve? Why can't we break this binary? And then for the opposition on this question of change, I love the arguments around the fact that we could change, and there's a conceptual possibility that you both paint around the fact that we might be able to. But in a world where resources are finite and scarce, is it really possible for this to happen? Or is it going to be the case that in reality, we will actually have tensions and trade-offs that we have to choose between? So take 10 seconds to think about that. I love this job because I get to ask these questions on both sides, right? And make things as difficult as possible for both teams. Chloe and Robin, would you guys like to start us off on this question of change?
Well, I think this question of change, I think probably everyone here does agree with the fact that things do need to change, and the point about autonomy and resilience of digital systems is a really good one, because ultimately there is little, we keep seeing it over and over again, as Maria pointed to, the CrowdStrike, the Amazon outage last week. But the point is that disentangling these systems and making those changes is a long and painful process. And that we're going to have to really analyze across the tech stack what are the interdependencies and which of those interdependencies really need to be tackled and which ones can actually be maybe, by creating more diversification in terms of dependencies, we might actually be able to make ourselves more resilient without going to the full-on sovereignty approach, which requires that we reshore and Europeanize all of these systems.
Okay, Robin, anything to add?
Yes, I was listening to Maria in her opening statement say that we should be concerned that individuals and companies in Europe choose companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Google for some of their operations. I think we should be much more concerned that entrepreneurs, hundreds of them every day, are already choosing the US to go and establish their companies, to raise investment from investors in those countries, to exit when they IPO or get acquired, to do that mostly in the US and other regions. That, I think, should be the main concern, because it's not like we cannot change, and it's not like we don't know what to do to change. It's just that the way that the EU is set up and the fragmentation that we have and the political reality prevents us from moving very fast and moving boldly, right? But we do have some strategy in place. I think the European Commission has a proposed startup and scale-up strategy. What is needed? Unified capital market, pan-European stock exchange, so people can actually exit their companies in Europe and list on a stock exchange here in Europe. 28 regime that makes it basically easier for entrepreneurs to incorporate, raise investment across borders in the EU, and not always having to set up a Delaware Inc. And go abroad.
Okay.
Etc.
Want to wrap up? Okay.
Etc.
All right, let's hear from the opposition then on their perspective on change here. Can your change, as you've outlined it, be realized in a world where resources are finite and where there are these bureaucratic rigidities and impediments? Would either of you like to start? Yeah.
I can start. You were mentioning the Draghi report, and I think it's a very good, very good starting point, because indeed that was a waking call, and that we need to move fast and we need to act fast on solving the issues. But what we see prominently in the Draghi report is the answer to competitiveness in very most cases is about EU sovereignty and is about bringing it together there. And I think the debate is not about if we need to choose between sovereignty and competitiveness, but the thing is we need to accelerate on we need more EU unity. And you were mentioning the 28 regime, the saving and investment unions, and indeed these instruments are very important to come fast, to allow basically Europe to respond as one, not as 27 member states with all of their framework that will impede the companies that moving from one to Germany to France because there's two different frameworks. What we need is more unity and a more integrated Europe. And so there, the debate, rather than moving from sovereignty versus competitiveness, is really about how can we be more integrated as Europe to serve sovereignty and competitiveness.
Maria, anything to add?
Yeah, a lot of the reason why European entrepreneurs go to America or are looking for American funding is because we have a fundamentally dysfunctional investment market, and so because we have just a couple of monopolies and duopolies who create kill zones around themselves, the path to wealth for European entrepreneurs has become build something that is big enough but not too big, potentially a real threat to US big tech, so that they will buy me and they will give me all the money and I can cash out. And so big tech, because we have allowed them in Europe to get so big without any opposition, they have become the exit path to wealth for a bunch of people who are setting up companies not to serve European needs, not to meet needs in the market, but to cash out. And so, they're money people. That's what they're going to do. But I think the failure has been in us allowing there to be only one exit strategy, and that look like you're going to be a threat in the future to US big tech, and they will buy you and they will kill you. That's, I think, what really has been going on there.
But
in terms of...
Sorry, go on, please.
Yeah, and just, what Chloe was saying is absolutely right. Why we have this concentrated fragility of our critical infrastructure. The internet was invented as a decentralized technology. The domain name system is a fundamentally decentralized technology, and yet it is so concentrated on, and I'm probably the one person in the room who understands what went wrong with AWS last week, because I worked in DNS for about 25 years. But we have allowed it to be concentrated into the control of a tiny couple of actors when it was designed to give us ultimate planetary resilience. And so I think we have to, competition means having lots of internet resolvers, lots of DNS resolvers, lots of cloud providers. And yes, right now I will say, and I'm going to volunteer this point to my opposition, which is that AWS is providing a scale of service that we are not able currently to match in Europe by any native European providers. And sorry, and I excuse me for using the word native. It's an awful word. Let's take that off the record. Any kind of homegrown alternatives. And so we've got to get that scale. We've got to get that real choice so that we can make new business models that serve us as Europeans.
Let me push the teams on one last thing, and I'll start with the opposition on this one, and we'll go to the prop after that, right? A number of questions have come in on how are we defining sovereignty here in the first place, right? So Nico has asked, what are your core parameters for sovereignty? You seem to be using different definitions. Charlotte, what is the definition of sovereignty you've based your arguments and position on? And there's a number of questions about what the dimensions of sovereignty need to include. Jimmy Farrell's question, which part of the AI stack can Europe be sovereign on first? We had a question earlier on about the role of energy sovereignty in this whole process. Do we need to include sovereignty in financing capabilities as well? How would you boil down on both of your teams your definitions of sovereignty here so that we can operationalize them in policy debates?
Well, I'm just going to reiterate what I said, but I won't go into detail. You know, we've got legal sovereignty, so all of it's all subject to European law, supports GDPR, does not go into some, US NSA bunker in Virginia to spy on us all and subvert our democracy. Technical sovereignty, so we don't have that big lock-in where it's more expensive. The cloud is like the Hotel California. It's easy to get in, but you are never going to leave. And then finally, economic sovereignty, where, the revenues that we are raising in Europe fund public services and innovation in Europe. Those are three just very basic definitions I would like to see us do more on.
Okay, and on the proposition side?
Well, I think I very much liked these definitions of sovereignty, and I would be inclined to agree, but I do think that there is a lot of discussion at the moment around sovereignty that is very much focused on how do we protect European industry from competition, and that is very much the sovereignty that we're, I guess, suggesting is in opposition to competitiveness. Yeah.
I mean, the previous panel touched a bit on the whole precautionary approach versus opportunity seeking, right? And it does seem that these definitions of sovereignty could have a more precautionary element, a risk management element versus a more opportunity seeking element. And depending on how we balance those, we might end up on different sides of this motion. So let's move now to the final stage of this discussion. I'll invite our proposition team to do their 4 minutes of closing arguments. Chloe, I think that's you, isn't it? Yeah.
So choices and compromises will have to be made, prioritizing either sovereignty or competitiveness at different moments. We've made the arguments that sovereignty should not equal protectionism, that Europe needs to lean into diversification strategies, particularly in key sectors where it has little chance of achieving a kind of extreme vision of sovereignty. Thirdly, that some of the goals when it comes to sovereignty, security, and democracy will require short-term hits when it comes to European competitiveness. Robin also alluded very much to the fact that sovereignty is not really a key motivator for innovators, and that it's a little bit besides the point when it comes to talking about the innovation ecosystem. Further, that this focus on avoiding dependencies may slow down opportunities for our entrepreneurs and slow down growth. And then on the opposition side, I think, as I've said, I think there were some really good points in terms of, I think we all agree in terms of the need for autonomy and resilience. But, just in the past few days, it was reported that NVIDIA is making a huge investment in Nokia, which is one of the few European champions in the tech ecosystem. Disentangling from big tech is really complicated. Similarly, the 5G technology that European companies are so proud of depends on those cloud services provided at the moment by US big tech. So it's really, really complicated, and it's going to take a long time to actually disentangle and to think through how do we actually achieve a certain level of resilience or, a kind of technical sovereignty, perhaps. Then when it comes to the renewables point and the fact that we can be both competitive and sovereign, I think, again, when we look at why the cost of renewables have gone down so much, it's not thanks to Europe. It's thanks to China. And I think that we would be foolish to think otherwise. So while I don't think that that means we should give up and that we should just let China dominate the renewables market, I think there needs to be some kind of realistic thinking about the fact that in certain segments of the market, China has won the race. And that the Europeans should focus on those parts of the tech stack where it can really be competitive. And it should put a lot of money into those sectors as well. So that means, not just thinking about the home market, but, being competitive and ultimately sovereign, perhaps, in renewables requires partnering with all of the countries in the southern Mediterranean that can be a real resource when it comes to renewable energy. So to conclude, I think today in Europe, there's a lot of obsessing about deregulation on the one hand in the name of competitiveness, and then protectionism on the other hand in the name of sovereignty. But I do think that the situation is more complex. The choices need to be made across the tech stack, dependencies analyzed, and real choices made so as to move forward. Thanks.
Lovely. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chloe, especially for reminding us about the importance of choices, compromise, and China. Some very important alliteration going on there. Maria, I'll let you have the last word for this whole debate.
Right, so. Well, yes, my colleague Toma reminds me that in China, it's a very important point, but also that China is dealing with some of the same issues we are, which is America. And so some of the same kind of responses. And in a way, we have to play a smart game of being friends, being allies, being a little bit transactional, being smart. And also, just back on the China thing, you buy this, you buy the minerals for the solar panels once, and you're done, and you put your panels up, and you're ahead. You depend on a drip feed of gas from Russia, and you'll be paying them every year, and they'll be taking their money and also their pound of flesh. But really, I want to come back to protectionism and isolationism. And is that really what we are doing here? Do our entrepreneurs and our investors and our citizens, do they deserve better than a Europe First strategy? And I think that's right. I'm going to hand that to the proposition. Europe First is not where we need to be. It's like world first. Where can we learn how to make competitive and choiceful, choice-maximizing choices up and down the internet stack? Well, we can look to Taiwan, where they have digital public infrastructure that is so mature, so well-governed, so democratic in its DNA. We have so much to learn from them. We can look to Brazil, where they have stood up their own national content spreading payment systems that are not the US ones and not China ones either. And they have made it work because they met local need. They provided a product that people wanted. They made a space for entrepreneurship. And they did that by physically, muscularly making that space. Because our entrepreneurs here do deserve better. And our entrepreneurs here in Europe are never going to do well if they are constantly trying to find a tiny little space to squeeze in between the two massive elephants in the room, be they Amazon and Microsoft, Google and Facebook and Apple. We have to make that space. That space is not going to be made for us. We have to make it, and we have to use our sharp and pointy elbows, and we have to use our regulation, and sometimes we have to use our criminal law to make sure that fraud is not supported here, that corruption and lobbying scandals are not supported here, and that we are not allowing people to buy influence. And I say that as an Irish person from Ireland, where we are the linchpin of how big tech has a stranglehold on European political economy. We are the people who are laundering the tax. We are the people who are appointing, as our data protection regulator, a Facebook lobbyist. So, to my fellow Europeans, please join me in doing something about Ireland, because if we don't do that, we're not going to very, very far at all. And I think, when we look at the trade deal capitulation, Le Grand Continent found that 63% of Europeans are embarrassed by the trade deal that Ursula von der Leyen did in August. When we look at that, it's business as usual. And really what we're seeing is there are so many people in this city that want to go on and just make a big speech, make a State of the Union speech saying dependencies are bad, fragility is bad, let's be resilient, let's be autonomous, and then not doing what we do, not taking radical action. I'm going to tell you why that is. Why are we subject to this EPP hive mind that says we're going to talk big and do nothing? We're going to talk big and make capitulatory trade deals to kings, to sovereigns, to tyrants. We're going to be embarrassed in front of our fellow Europeans because we did not stand up when history came to find us. Because this time, my friends, the Americans are not coming to save us. It is we who must save ourselves. And so, when I look at the radical action that we need to take, that has to be taken for us to save European democracy, it has to come from people like us, not from people like Ursula von der Leyen and the EPP. For them, radical action is wearing a red tie on Tuesday instead of a blue tie. That is not radical. We need to be proud of ourselves as Europeans, but also reach across the oceans to our friends in Brazil, our friends in Taiwan, to our friends in Nairobi who are standing up some of the most competitive, choiceful, innovative, and products that actually meet people's needs, not toxic innovation. That's who we need to be, not just talking to, listening to, making friends with, making allies, making bonds across the world for technology that is open, that is decentralized, that is a realm for competition, and that is a place where we use to grow our democracy, to spread our democracy and invent it anew, because that is what we as Europeans have always shown to the world. We've not been perfect. We went out and colonized. We did tax havens. But one thing that we have shown is that democracy, the rule of law, and human rights are not just fundamental European values, they are fundamental human values, and that we can hold on to them, and we can win. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much to all four of you, to both teams for this really wonderful discussion. And like I said, right, this helping of all of us to get further in the identifying of the extremes of these arguments so that we can get to a better understanding of where exactly truth might lie in the murky middle ground between all of these issues. I won't even attempt to summarize this debate, but I will say a couple of things, which is that I think you've given us so much to think about. And for me, a lot of it's kind of boiled down to the letters C, F, and G, given who our hosts are today, because we are able to think a lot about choices and the fact that we have a choice here, but the one that is constrained nonetheless by fundamental realities. We have to think about capabilities a great deal in terms of whether we have the right talents and people resources in this work. We have a whole bunch of federated strengths that we can use in Europe, but at the same time, those might well become rigidities given the kinds of bureaucracies that the proposition talked about. But we also have governance strengths, which the opposition kind of dealt with in great detail, that can become a source of competitive advantage. As we end this debate, though, I thought it would be useful to also think about where the next set of discussions might also need to go. And one thing that struck me, no criticism of anybody in the debate, you guys were valiant in this, but I think we talked a lot about the kind of macro view of Europe, and only towards the end did we start thinking about people like us, to use your phrase, Maria. What are we doing all this for, right? And what do we do this in aid of in terms of European citizens' welfare? And here I think the letters C, F, and G give us some kind of broad frame to think about where we might go as well. Cynthia talked about in her previous panel, right, the importance of courage, collaboration, and compassion so that we exercise care for European citizens. Ultimately, that's what competitiveness and/or sovereignty need to be moving in aid of. But the F is important as well, right? We want to be doing this so that people can lead flourishing lives, and there needs to be a focus in policy on that. But ultimately, we also want to have some of this be a ground-up process, not just one that is imposed top-down on European citizens, but that in the spirit of the digital public infrastructure in Taiwan and Brazil that Maria mentioned, right, we are thinking a lot about how this breaks new ground for individual citizens and their participation in their collective futures. So thank you very much for being part of articulating part of that future and for being so wonderful in terms of sharing both your experiences as well as the arguments that are out there for both sides of this motion. A round of applause again for both teams.